Today we are looking at an 1862 homicide inquiry in Lowell, Massachusetts, centered on a mill seamstress named Eliza Davenport and the counting room death that turned her boarding house in the canal city inside out. By daylight, she mended uniforms under the clatter of looms. By night, a ledger page, a vial with the wrong label, and a single heel print began measuring the rest of her life. Everyone agreed someone visited Amos Whitcomb after 9. No one agreed why a woman who saved thread scraps would leave a brooch behind, unless what happened wasn't a murder at all. You're watching True Crime Files. Don't forget to subscribe for more cases like this. Lowell in 1862 sounded mechanical and wet. Canals slapped stone, and the mills coughed lint into every coat sleeve. Gas lamps gave the streets a buttery haze, even as the war took men and sent back lists. Tension lived between the river and the brick. Eliza rented a narrow bed at Mrs. Pike's boarding house on Dutton Street. She was 32, brisk in speech, careful with money. 2 dresses, both dark, boots half-soled at Welch's on Appleton, a brooch that held a curl of her late sister's hair. She stitched for Whitcomb and Howe, the largest contractor for army overcoats, which meant long hours and steady pay, until the night the paymaster died. Amos Whitcomb kept his counting room just off the loading court. One window, iron grates, green baize on the desk, a brass lockbox, and a crate of sherry bottles for visiting buyers. He was 50, thrifty, and not well liked. People said his pen drew blood without a knife. On the evening in question, the factory whistle marked 9. The watchman, Derwin Bolt, began his rounds with a tin lantern. He later swore a woman in a dark bonnet slipped into Whitcomb's door and left it on the latch. He did not see her face, only the varnished shine of boots hitting puddles as she entered. He would prove certain of the time, less certain of the person. Eliza said she was at the Lyceum, 2 blocks away, listening to a talk on the telegraph and the war. Others recalled her voice at the question period, asking how far a message could outrun a train. It was a good alibi and idea, and a poor one in detail. Few remembered when she left the hall. At dawn, a clerk found Whitcomb behind his desk, face gray, paper knife on the floor. The window was latched from inside, no sign of a struggle except the chair half turned and a faint splash of sherry on the mat. The physician's first thought was apoplexy. Then he smelled almonds and revised it to something chemical. Hydrocyanic acid was the term he used in his notes. Prussic acid in speech. Apothecaries sold tiny quantities for toothache or, wickedly, for other purposes. A single swallow could arrest a man's breath. The sherry glass on Whitcomb's desk smelled wrong and not from age. The constable, Silas Cobb, drew lines on a map and made rounds. He checked boarding houses for late returns. He visited Welch's cobbler and asked about half-moon brass tacks and heels. He noted that Eliza's pair had been repaired 2 weeks prior with a peculiar nickel plate. He wrote that down and kept the pencil there. He also visited the Lyceum and wrote down which benches were scuffed. Eliza received the visit with a needle still in her mouth. She allowed the constable to search her trunk. Inside, 2 letters wrapped in blue thread, 3 folded shirtwaists, a sample card of buttons, and a small glass vial marked laudanum. The stopper was tight. The label was neat and said Brewers. Dr. Nathaniel Brewer ran the apothecary near the canal bridge. He had sold Eliza laudanum for sleeplessness after a fever. He said so without hesitation. He also said he had not sold prussic acid to anyone in a month. His ledger, however, had a torn page after September. He said a boy had spilled ink. The page was ruined and removed. The ragged edge did not look like ink trouble. At Mrs. Pike's, a younger boarder named Ruthie Lang provided color. Ruthie worked the buttonhole machine, sang hymns in a bright voice, and observed much more than people liked. She remembered Eliza leaving after 8 with a shawl but returning late, bonnet askew and hands cold. She also remembered Eliza missing her brooch the next morning, then finding it hours later in a pocket she rarely used. Ruthie told the constable that the brooch had not been in that pocket before. The lockbox in Whitcomb's room had been pried, not forced. A tidy sum was present, which argued against robbery. Yet a single slip was missing from the bill bundle. An IOU with initials Ed the clerk admitted Whitcomb occasionally made small private loans with lively interest. He would never do so without collateral. James Caldwell of the Lowell Daily Citizen sharpened his pencil. He wrote that a woman had been seen entering. He wrote that a letter had gone by telegraph to Boston the next morning, paid in cash. The clerk at the telegraph office thought the woman was Eliza. Papers in Boston ran the item under the war letters. Then the city cast its eye back. Eliza worked while questions mounted. Needles singed her fingers where she gripped too hard. At noon, Mrs. Pike set out stew and bread with an extra firmness that said, "We will not speak." Eliza knotted her napkin and said little. She knew the quiet was louder than rumor. The formal arrest came on the third day. Cobb took her from the cutting floor in view of 24 workers and a pile of blue-gray cloth. She asked if she might at least wash her hands. He said yes, because even in a city of mills, a clean hand meant something in court. The crowd made a path with eyes rather than feet. In the lockup, she gave her version with care. She had gone to the Lyceum, left before the end, and walked by the factory to take air. She saw Whitcomb's light. She considered asking for an advance, but did not knock. She walked onto the bridge and watched a small towing mule drink. She returned by another street. She had not purchased prussic acid. She had no use for it. She barely used the laudanum. Her voice evened when she said the last part. Cobb asked about the IOU. Eliza said he had held back 2 weeks' wages during a stoppage and lent her the very same money as a favor. She signed to avoid eviction. The rate was cruel but legal. She promised to produce witnesses to the arrangement. Cobb wrote and said the court would listen. The autopsy confirmed cyanide in the stomach, only a few drops. The stomach lining showed rapid collapse. The paper knife had no blood on it. It had fallen in the rush of dying as elbows clipped the desk. The sherry bottle contained a trace amount and was corked with a slice of rag, not its original stopper. The rag smelled of laudanum, masking the almond scent. That suggested intent, not accident. Apothecary Brewer brought in his ledger. He had copied the torn page from memory, he said. 3 entries for prussic acid sat in the month before Whitcomb's death, to a tanner, to a taxidermist, to a physician in Cambridge. None were to a woman. Eliza's laudanum purchase sat 2 lines under the last entry. Cobb asked why the torn edge showed fibers of the prussic page and not the laudanum page. Brewer said binding was never perfect. Cobb noted the coincidence. The heel print in Whitcomb's office was thin with water and grit. It matched Welch's nickel plate pattern closely. Welch, when asked, said he had repaired 3 pairs in that style in the past month, Eliza's, Ruthie Lang's, and a watchman's. Ruthie smiled when she heard it and said a woman deserved quiet boots in a house where doors seemed to open at night. The watchman scowled and touched the brim of his cap. Caldwell kept printing. He printed Whitcomb's civil cases and small claims. He dug up a woman in Pawtucket who said Whitcomb had advanced cash for her cousin and then kept the cousin late in his office behind a locked door. He printed what the cousin said later, under breath and a veil. The city's opinion of Whitcomb worsened, which either helped Eliza or hurt her, depending on a juror's temper. A turning point came from a stove. A sweep cleaning soot from Mrs. Pike's kitchen found charred slips hidden under ash that the boarders said burned too slowly for kindling. One slip was from Brewer's ledger. A tail of a date, faint ink, the letters Prus, and a cracked line. Another slip carried a half-written list of debts with the initials AW and a soft graphite tick. The handwriting on both scraps was neat, feminine, and not Eliza's. Ruthie had the neatest hand in the house. Ruthie said she had burned old notes as a kindness to Mrs. Pike. She often tidied the stove when others forgot. She said the ledger scrap had been wrapped around spices, as shopkeepers sometimes did. She had not read it. She said the debt list belonged to no one she knew. She despised accusations and long stares. Cobb petitioned for a search of Ruthie's trunk. The magistrate gave it with a pinch of lips. In the trunk, hymn book, ribbon, small sewing kit, folded newspapers, a copperplate handwriting copybook. Tucked in the copybook was a practice note of the phrase received of Mr. Whitcomb, looped 4 times. She said she liked the shape of the R in received. Cobb said many did, few practiced it. The prosecutor built a clean narrative. A woman with a grievance poisons a man who holds her wages and reputation. She purchases acid under another name or steals it by means of a torn ledger page. She masks the scent with laudanum and staggers time of death by loosening the window and resecuring it. She leaves a brooch to mislead the eye, then returns to retrieve it. He liked the line about the eye. The defense lawyer, Edwin Carter, preferred grit. He showed that Brewer's ledger had been rewritten more than once. He called Welch to testify about the nickel plate heel and how the design was common for those with an inward step. He had Welch mark Cobb's gait as inward before the court, which made the gallery laugh and the constable blush. He suggested the watchman's vision by lantern should not hang a woman. The judge stopped the laughter with a look. Carter also produced a letter Eliza had written to her cousin in Salem the week prior. She wrote of saving nickels to pay Whitcomb and to be loose of him for good. She wrote she intended to appeal to the overseers if he refused fair accounting. The letter carried no bile, only tired resolve. It made sense to anyone who ever worked a long day. Brewer stood again and swore to the integrity of his shop. He could not explain the torn page beyond clumsiness. He could not account for a report that a young woman, bonneted and veiled, had asked for a dram of the bitter almond 2 weeks earlier. The boy at the counter had gone to the back. When he returned, she was gone. Brewer had made a note that bedtime and then misplaced it. His face arranged itself into professionalism under strain. Into this came Caldwell with an expose that he pushed to press the night before the verdict. He said Whitcomb had used the IOU system to place certain workers under his thumb. He did not say exactly how tight. He named initials that were not Eliza's. The judge scolded the paper during proceedings and cautioned the jury to ignore it. But jurors read, even when they said they did not. The most curious testimony arrived from a dyer named Abel Fisk. He had taken dinner near the mills the night in question and walked by the office door. He saw through the window Great's 2 figures. He swore the visitor wore a bonnet, yes, but he also swore the visitor stood taller than Eliza by a good hand. Ruthie was taller by that measure. He hedged when pressed, yet he did not break. Mrs. Pike belatedly offered an alibi for Ruthie. She said Ruthie had been knitting in the parlor with her the entire hour after 9. The parlor clock had chimed, and Ruthie had remarked the tune. Another boarder said he had heard no knitting and no tune. He had heard the mother keep a daughter close. The judge allowed the contradiction with a wince. Carter's closing chose ambiguity over romance. He said the state had produced a chemically sound story bolted to uncertain feet. He said his client had motive to be free, not to kill. He lifted the brooch with thumb and forefinger and asked why a woman who wore grief at her throat would forget it on a stranger's desk. He let the silence chew on the answer. The jury reported after a night and a morning. On the charge of murder, they found Eliza not guilty. On the matter of tampering with evidence, namely the retrieval of the brooch from the office before dawn, they were split and then silent. The judge dismissed the lesser count to avoid a second trial. Eliza looked older and very straight. Cobb removed the cuffs and did not meet her eye. Lowell returned to its work, but work changed flavor. Women in the mills discussed ledgers as if they were knives. Some refused to sign IOUs. A committee of overseers wrote a fresh policy on wage advances that required a witness and a second set of books. Brewer purchased a new ledger and never tore from it again. These were the plain fruits of one death. Eliza tried to resume the rhythm: needles, bread, sleep. Men stopped talking when she entered shops. She answered that with balance in her steps and exact change on counters. She met Caldwell once by the canal, and he apologized in the new reporter way, meaning he was sorry she had suffered and also that his story had missed a detail. She nodded and walked on. In the spring of 1863, Ruthie left Mrs. Pike's house without farewell. She moved to a larger place with relatives near Centralville and took in piecework where the buttonholes sang again. She coughed through winter and turned away from stairs. In May of 1864, she died of consumption, the way the doctor wrote it for the record, but relatives found among her things a sheet that did not read like him. The letter was addressed but never sent. It said, "I meant only to make him scare." It said she had learned from Whitcomb that debt moved people like a stick moved cattle. It said she had wrapped a rag with drops and corked the bottle for the smell so that he would taste fear and spout promises, and then she would pour the glass away. It said she did not know how fast the drops would move. It did not name the acid. It did not name Eliza, except to say she was kind. A minister read it and called it the work of a fever. A cousin copied it in case papers changed their minds. Caldwell investigated again. He confirmed the letter's hand with old notes. He visited Brewer, who avoided his eye. He asked Welch about the heel plates and times and wrote a final column without a single flourish. He noted that law preferred living testimony to words from a trunk, which meant consolation only, not remedy. Then he folded his notebook and kept it as a guard against too much certainty. Eliza saved and left Lowell in the late summer of 1864. She took a position in a smaller shop near Newburyport, where sea air did not carry lint. She married years later to a widower who asked no questions and provided a quiet cottage behind a cooper's yard. She wore no brooch. Her children, if asked what their mother had done in youth, said she made coats for soldiers and kept accounts straight. The Whitcomb counting room became a foreman's office. The Sherry stain lived in the floorboards until the plank was replaced and burned. The watchman Derwin Bolt moved to a river town in New Hampshire, where he kept time for a bridge company and learned to be less certain of faces through dirty glass. Cobb retired to a farm and limped on bad weather days as if the nickel plate memory pinched his heel. The case appears in law lectures now and then under the heading of circumstantial chains. Instructors point to the chemical evidence as near perfect and the human evidence as noisy. They ask students how much noise a court should permit before it drowns out a life. The room usually goes quiet after that. It also surfaces in histories of mill towns, where it stands for a common shape of harm: a man with books and a key, a woman with wages and a room she might lose, an acid that smells like almonds when courage runs out. The details are local, but the shape traveled. If you visit Lowell on a gray afternoon, you can still walk the canal that mirrors the old factory windows. The water sounds like cloth on a table. The green paint on doors peels in the same old way. No plaque names Eliza or Ruthie or Amos, which is a kind of verdict too. Standing on the bridge where she said she once stopped, the city is another city, and yet you can measure the same distances by step and breath. 2 blocks to the Lyceum site, 3 to the boarding house street that changed names, 1 to the shop where apothecaries wrote neat lines. You can count the beats and imagine a woman deciding which door to open. You can also imagine her choosing none. The lesson people draw depends on where they put their attention. Some focus on the rag in the bottle and the quickness of what it hid. Some focus on the heel print and how easy it is to match the wrong foot. Others sit with the letter unsent, where intent and accident share a table and neither wants to rise first. That last spot is where the story breathes longest. In the end, the case altered rules more than lives. Paperwork grew thicker, door latches got repaired, ledger pages stayed bound. Women learned to bring a friend when they asked for what they had already earned. Men who made loans looked up when a door opened and learned the cost of private generosity said too softly. Eliza Davenport is a name you pass over in census lines unless you know to stop. Here she is the center of a wheel that turned many spokes: law, labor, reputation, breath. What happened in that room remains part evidence and part guess, and perhaps that is fitting for a city that ran on rhythm more than certainty. A century and a half later, the clatter is faded, but the questions still carry.